The Building Show, where ideas connect. For 34 years, The Building Show is where people connect through Construct Canada, PM Expo, Home Builder Renovator Expo, and the World of Concrete Toronto Pavilion. Visit the Metro Toronto Convention Centre South from November 30th to December 2nd to make the connections which will give you a competitive edge. For more information, email events@informacanada.com or visit thebuildingshow.com. Hello and welcome to the Construction Record Podcast. I'm digital media editor Warren Frey. Daily Commercial News and Journal of Commerce were on the ground at the recent Canadian Council for Public-Private Partnerships annual conference held in Toronto. On our last episode, we heard from Canadian Infrastructure Bank CEO Aaron Corey. On this episode, we speak to Derek Chum. He's the Vice President of Indigenous Community and Engagement, a leading firm in Indigenous stakeholder engagement that develops reconciliation-rooted approaches to advancing Indigenous socio-economic development in Canada. We spoke about the recent announcement of a limited partnership called Indigenous E3, which is a special purpose limited partnership formed between SNC-Lavalin and Indigenous Community and Engagement, whose stated aim is to identify and deliver projects that support Indigenous advancement and long-term prosperity. Throughout the interview, we also refer to a speech delivered at the conference by Michael Fox, who is the President and CEO of Indigenous Community Engagement, about the emerging power of Indigenous nations in the infrastructure space. Here's my interview with Derek. I hope you enjoy it. What is ICE? It was just announced today, I believe. So maybe we can go into what it is and its purpose.
Okay, so ICE is a firm that specializes in community engagement, specifically Indigenous communities, when it comes to infrastructure projects and local projects in communities. We work with communities to ensure that they understand and have an informed view on these projects, and that they understand the proponent, what the proponent is looking to do. So ICE, what was announced today, it was a partnership with SNC-Lavalin to form a limited liability partnership, a limited partnership to which we call Indigenous E3. And the purpose of Indigenous E3 is to bring together the work that ICE does with community engagement and to bring the services of SNC together. And together, through this limited partnership, seek out work and opportunities involving Indigenous communities across Canada.
And what stages, besides announcing it, what stages is that in terms of projects that are going to happen, or is that something you can even comment on at this point?
At this point, being a new entity, we are looking for work to kick off work with the Indigenous E3. That said, SNC and ICE are presently working together on some of the proposed roads to the Ring of Fire. So we do have an existing relationship. Mm-hmm. However, the Indigenous E3 is something that we're starting today. Mm-hmm. and looking forward for new opportunities.
And I think, well, we both, because you got called out in the actual session, Michael Fox spoke to the P3 attendees. That's where we're recording this, is the P3 2022 conference. And he was mentioning, just on a larger scope, how infrastructure is needed, specifically with Ring of Fire, but this goes for anything, how you need world-class infrastructure to get this product out in the first place. So maybe we could speak to that and how SNC's role and all that.
Absolutely. So, when it comes to the proposed roads for the Ring of Fire, not much will happen until there are roads in place to service these sites. And, that goes for any number of projects in rural and remote communities. And, we're hopeful that this partnership will be able to participate in these new projects and unlock some of the value. And work with Indigenous communities and bring some benefits to those communities. I think you heard Mike speak about that too, about how, you need a healthy community in order to take advantage of what these projects can bring to a community.
Yeah, he put it better than I think I've honestly ever heard before, where he said, you can't think about the future when you're in pain. I'm like, well, that kind of crystallizes the whole deal, doesn't it?
It really puts it in perspective. That's right. If you expect a community to respond to the opportunities, they have to be in a position to do so. Mm-hmm. And some communities are unfortunately behind, when it comes to educational outcomes and things like that. And we need to close some gaps in order for communities to take full advantage of what's in front of them.
And one thing Michael mentioned was that Indigenous consultation, it started out as people going, well, we have to redesign this in order to conform to what's needed. Now it's almost like lean principles. It's from the very start. You work Indigenous principles into it. So first of all, what are some of those Indigenous principles, and how do you work those into, from the ground up, into a project?
Yeah, from the ground up, right, means understanding what the community values in their traditional lands, what areas are considered to be, untouchable, or perhaps if you are going to work in there, what trade-offs are proponents willing to present to the communities. It's really about understanding how the community uses their land, and it may not always be apparent from an outsider looking in. However, a lot of the land use goes back many generations, and it's not always apparent again from the outside what's important. So it's to get the First Nations to tell you from the outset, I think your project is better off. Then you're not wasting time proposing something that is going to cause an impact on someone's traditional use of the lands.
And it's important to note, because outsiders, including myself, do this all the time. It's not a monolithic body of people. Every different nation has different concerns. So maybe we could kind of go into Ontario specifically, what some of those concerns might be, depending on the nation.
Well, from what we hear, water and healthy water systems, being able to continue to fish and use the rivers and lakes in a way that's sustainable going forward, very important. Access to the land for harvesting, ensuring that sites for hunting will continue to exist. It's those types of things, In most cases, development is welcome. However, it has to be balanced with the traditional uses of the land that have been going on for many, many generations. That needs to continue. It's essential. It's core to the culture. So, like I say, development is largely welcome. However, it's with that respect given to traditional uses of land.
And Michael specifically said about the Ring of Fire, how the people on that land were at first opposed to it and now they're proponents. So maybe you could speak to, I don't know if you know the specifics, but if you could speak to how that sort of chain of events comes about from the SNC point of view or from the industry point of view, I guess.
I would say, yeah, from the industry point of view, it all comes down to education and understanding, right? A lot of people have, when you say the word mining, a lot of things come to mind for some people. In some cases, it's negative. In some cases, it's positive, depending on your history and experience with that sector. So, when you go into a part of the country where these things haven't happened traditionally and there's been no exposure to it, what comes forward typically is the negative. The negative impression, stands out first and foremost. So it takes a lot of educating to, turn that perception around. And that starts through conversations, right? Understanding what are you looking to do here? How is it going to work? How is it going to impact us? And as those conversations unfold, perceptions, could perhaps begin to change too.
And just in terms of training, because I know that's probably part of a push, is speaking of education, there's probably a push for skilled trades training in those communities. So how does SNC-Lavalin fit into that?
So, as this project develops and as it becomes more of a reality, these types of training programs will be developed in due course as the project becomes more real, right? And a lot of it, like I say, begins with the roads. Without the roads, not much will happen. So I think as you see that project advance, you'll see in parallel other elements coming into play, training being one of them. And as you know, it's, the skills gap is not just up in that part of the country, but it's across Canada, right? So it's certainly something that's felt across the province, across Canada. But again, we have to be mindful of the opportunity that exists for these communities that are going to be specifically impacted, and their needs need to be considered and taken into consideration as we develop these programs.
And for the the news release for the ICE initiative, it mentioned reconciliation and how that works into what SNC-Lavalin is doing. So maybe you could speak to that as well.
Yeah, I think a lot of it is understanding, that we are working in the traditional lands, understanding that First Nation communities their concerns have not always been heard, their interests not recognized. So I think part of it is turning our ear to these concerns, hearing them and acting on them, right? And again, to the extent this work is being done on their land, there should be benefits that flow to them as a result, right? And what those benefits look like, traditionally we've seen it in terms of employment and training, contracting opportunities, and more increasingly, ownership stakes in elements of any given project. So certainly those are things that I think that communities will expect, and Indigenous E3, I expect would want to respond to those in a way that's going to make the relationships work.
In fact, Michael mentioned that the equity journey, for lack of a better term, has kind of grown over the past 20-odd years, where now Indigenous communities have an actual stake in this as opposed to just being consulted or having less of a stake, let's put it that way.
Yeah. Oh, for sure. And that's you mentioned hydro as an example. I worked on a hydro project with my community, Moose Cree First Nation, and in their partnership with Ontario Power Generation on a redevelopment of a existing series of dams. And the outcome of that project was my community owning a quarter of that new generation. And we're talking about a project that will generate revenue for 100 years. Very meaningful to my community, and the benefits it will offer. Again, very meaningful and hopefully transformative in a number of ways too.
Okay, thanks, Derek, for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks for listening to the Construction Record Podcast. You can hear us on Apple Music, Spotify, and Amazon Music, and on Daily Commercial News and Journal of Commerce websites. And be sure to check out our P3 feature page, which is on both websites. Thanks for listening.